Right, so we're interested really, the initial impetus for these studies was our interest in risk factors, genetic risk factors for sudden cardiac death. And it's a particularly challenging problem in that a third of people who have sudden cardiac death, that's their first symptom, and they're already dead. So you can't find other things, and 2/3 of them may have some symptom, but nothing that would warrant clinical intervention. So the idea of finding genetic risk factors that you could use to identify these people before they have their sudden death event would be greatly beneficial. The particular research is focused on the QT interval, which is a measure of cardiac repolarization. And our interest in that was there's data from Mendelian diseases where people who have extremely long or extremely short QT interval are at increased risk for sudden death. Subsequent work in large population-based studies has shown that prolonged QT interval is also associated with risk of sudden death in the general population. So the nice thing about it is here you have a phenotype where you can measure it in everybody. So in our case we have, I think in this study, 15,000 samples who've been measured for QT interval, and we can then use that information in all those samples to look for genes that predict QT interval with the idea that perhaps these same genes predict risk for sudden cardiac death. Whereas in sudden cardiac death, it's a rare enough event, and since people actually die from it, it's hard to get DNA after the fact. So the sample sizes are much smaller. So here we're trying to leverage what we refer to as an endophenotype to try to tackle sort of the more complicated phenotype of sudden death. Turns out in very short, so if we look in a broad population, we don't really see, we just see the longer the QT, the higher the risk. But if you actually look in these rare Mendelian syndromes, there's long QT syndrome, and there's also short QT syndrome where people have extremely short repolarization. So both of those, in those cases, are sort of indicative that there's something wrong with the sort of the electrical mechanisms that are going on in the heart.